Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Today I'll be talking with you about the tongue and the tablet, writing and language, Aramaic and Akkadian in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Where here the tongue refers to the spoken language that will have prevailed at the time, whereas the tablet refers to what was written. So when we think of the ancient Near East and Assyria in particular, the image that we have is dominated very much by one particular kind of textuality. That's the cuneiform record. We have thousands, tens of thousands of texts written in the cuneiform script on various media, primarily clay, but also stone and other media in the Sumero-Akkadian language. And this accounts for the overwhelming majority of the textual material that we have from all of early Assyrian history through to the fall of the Assyrian Empire. But when we look at a map of the Assyrian Empire, the first thing that we note is the incredible scale of this state. So it encompassed lands all the way from Egypt to Iran, from Anatolia into the Arabian desert, and we know from many different sources, including Assyrian sources themselves, that the vast majority of people throughout this area will not have been speaking Sumerian or Akkadian at any point. So this was a hugely multilingual empire, despite the fact that the textual record that we have is overwhelmingly Sumero-Akkadian in character. So the question that then follows fairly logically is, if we have all of this textual material that's written in one language, but we know that a lot of people would have been speaking other languages, most people would have been speaking other languages, can we actually assume that just because they're writing in Akkadian, this is actually the language that they're speaking at all, certainly when it comes to the Neo-Assyrian period, which is the latest period in ancient Assyrian history. So one of the things that we'll look at to try to answer this question is the disjuncture between writing and speech. I think we're all aware that the language that we use in writing is not the same as the language that we speak, even today. When I'm writing an email or a text, it sounds different, it looks different than when I'm speaking casually in conversation. So this very simple premise has very broad implications. One of the places that we can go to look at the implications are other historical examples. So today, when we think of France, we think of la francophonie, this great culture that is very much focused on this single language. But just a little over 200 years ago, the majority of France was not actually French-speaking. The French that we know today is limited, historically, to the area of Ile-de-France, Paris, that region, and gradually it spreads out. In the 19th century, a lot of France was speaking different languages, some of them completely unrelated to French, like Bretagne in Normandy, German in Alsace, Italian in Corsica, but also other languages that now are not broadly spoken, like Occitan, Provençal, and others. The only way that France became the kind of bastion of francophone culture that we know today is through an intensive state effort. So in the 19th century, the state invested heavily in schools that were extended to every village, every region, where children were taught a standardized form of French that everybody would then learn, everybody would use in writing, and gradually spread to become the dominant language throughout the whole of the country. This sort of process is mirrored in many different times and places. In Germany, there's also historically a great variety of different Germans. Even today, spoken Swiss German is pretty much unintelligible to other German speakers. And in England, if you visit Britain, the English that one speaks in Glasgow sounds completely different from the English of London, and many people find them mutually incomprehensible. If we think of modern Aramaic as well, the different Aramaic dialects are not always intelligible from one group to the other. The only way that we can get these mass national languages is through having an organized state system that is focused on investing resources and getting everybody to speak and learn language in a certain way according to certain standards. That's how in the modern period we get the creation of these national languages. These conditions don't exist in antiquity. The ancient Assyrian state, as any pre-modern state, did not have the capacity or the interest to impose this kind of standardized language on anybody. There were no major national languages in antiquity. These states simply didn't have the means to create them. So if we get back to Akkadian then, if it's not a national language, then what is it? What is this phenomenon that we're dealing with of people writing for so long in Akkadian? And here it helps to look at this question from a different angle, and that's the angle of the Sumero-Akkadian scribal tradition. So to get back to a map, here we have a map of the ancient Near East. What's interesting about this map is that every single site on the map is a city in which we have recovered archaeologically texts, primarily tablets, written in Sumero-Akkadian. The chronological scope here is over thousands of years. This map is not exhaustive. There are plenty of other sites that are not on the map where we have also found evidence of Sumero-Akkadian writing, but nonetheless it gives you an indicative picture of where Sumero-Akkadian was written. And one of the things that's startling, again, is this disjuncture between the scope, the geographic extent of Sumero-Akkadian writing and the actual places where we expect that these languages would have been spoken. So Sumerian and Akkadian come from the historical region of southern Iraq, Sumer and Akkad, which is very small compared to the rest of the sites that we have here. So in some of these places we know that they never will have spoken either of these languages, like Egypt, or for most of the communities in Anatolia, and yet we have texts written in this script and in these languages. The question then becomes why? Maybe it helps to pause just to reflect on what Sumero-Akkadian writing is anyway, and why I'm calling it Sumero-Akkadian rather than just Akkadian. So the earliest writing in Iraq, and presumably also in the world, emerged in the 4th millennium BCE to represent the Sumerian language. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. That is, it's not related to any currently existing language, to any known language at all. So the cuneiform script emerged to represent this writing, so it has a lot of quirks and curiosities that are particular to the needs of people who want to write in Sumerian. The two languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, were spoken in much of the same region. There's this phenomenon that, again, linguists call a Sprachbund, kind of a union of languages. So this is an area where more than one language is spoken, and the people who speak this language are in intense daily contact with people who speak another language. As a result, the two languages slowly influence each other quite dramatically. We see this between Sumerian and Akkadian. There's lots of loan words in both directions. There's grammatical influence, syntactic influence between the two. Although the writing system developed to represent Sumerian very quickly, because it's the same place where people are speaking a lot of Akkadian, it was adapted also to represent Akkadian. One of the consequences of this is that for anybody who's learning to write in the cuneiform system, to be able to do it proficiently, you need to learn some Sumerian. It's not that you learn to speak Sumerian fluently, but you need to have some proficiency in Sumerian to be able to write Akkadian as well. So the two languages in writing become kind of a wedded unit. So even when you're writing exclusively in Akkadian or something that's to be read as Akkadian text, it requires you to know some Sumerian as well. Once Akkadian is written down, it has a very long history. It's written for more than 2,500 years. And one of the startling things here is that although there are varieties of Akkadian, there's Assyrian and Babylonian where there's some dialectical differences, there's different registers, and there's also change over time. The fact is that something that's written in 2000 BCE can, in many contexts, be quite easily intelligible to somebody in 1000 BCE. So the language is remarkably static, and much more so than you'd expect for a spoken language. As we know, the language of Shakespeare is not so easy to understand for somebody writing today. And if we talk about the English of the more Norse period, Beowulf, things like that, they're completely unintelligible to a modern English speaker. And this is true for spoken language in general. It changes quite quickly. Written language, on the other hand, has much more conservative in nature, and the change is much more slow. And this is something that we see in written Akkadian as well. It's not to say that there is no change, but it is not the speed of change and the intensity of change that we would expect for a language that was entirely spoken. This is also quite remarkable. So scholars these days say that Sumerian probably died out as a major spoken language by 2000 BCE, and yet 2,000 years later, people were still writing in Sumerian. So even though nobody was speaking this language at all at that point, and hadn't been for well in excess of a millennium, people were still writing it fairly proficiently when we were approaching the Common Era, so the time of Jesus and after. So how do we account for this phenomenon? So there are two major things to note. One, as we've said, is the geographical extensiveness of the area in which people are writing within the Sumero-Akkadian tradition, which is well beyond the scope of the area where anybody ever will have spoken these languages. And second is the long time span, so that the languages don't change as much as you would expect if they reflect a continuing tradition of speech. And we'll get into the details momentarily. So how do we make sense of this? Well, there's a very nice concept developed by Sheldon Pollock in the context of Sanskrit literature, which is the cosmopolis. So Sheldon Pollock wanted to understand why the Sanskrit language, which is very important in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition of South Asia, of the Indian subcontinent, why this language ended up being written also by a lot of people in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia as well, by individuals that never spoke it naturally. It was never their native language. Nobody in these areas ever spoke it as a mother tongue, but yet there are plenty of texts that were transmitted there and reproduced there independently of South Asia. So to understand this concept, this phenomenon, he developed this concept of a cosmopolis, which is this idea that we have these authoritative written traditions that spread over a broad region that encompass many different communities of many different backgrounds. So regardless of what their native language is, the culture that they live in, they all buy into this overarching scribal or cultural tradition and engage with its texts, its authoritative texts. So they're all studying these texts in the languages in which they're written, and to be part of this intellectual elite literary culture, you learn these texts even if that's not a language that you speak, even if it's not a language that you have any other practical interest in. One of the things that we see within the cosmopolis is something that we were just talking about, is that because these languages end up being divorced from speech, so people are studying certain texts that have an authoritative status. It's the language of these texts that is the one that becomes part of the tradition, regardless of any subsequent developments in the language in which they were written. Of course, Sanskrit is not the only example of this. We can think of Greek in antiquity, where people throughout the Mediterranean region will have been studying in Greek, even though they didn't speak it as a native language. Later, within the Western Christian tradition, we can think of Latin, and we can also think for modern Arameans, or Assyrians or Chaldeans or whatever term you prefer, of the Syriac language. So the Syriac language is now quite distant from most of the dialects, the spoken dialects of Aramaic, but people who engage with the tradition will learn Syriac. So it has the same sort of status, or Arabic we can also think of for Muslim communities throughout the world. So even if you're in Indonesian and you don't speak Arabic, to engage with the Islamic tradition, with the Quran and all of that, you will learn Arabic, and the Arabic that you will learn is also not the spoken Arabic of Iraq or of Morocco, but Fusha, the language of the Quran, which is of course more than 1,000 years old at this point, and quite different in some respects from the modern colloquial forms of Arabic. So if we apply this to the Sumero-Akkadian tradition, and we think of that as a cosmopolis, we can see that there is some alignment with the concept and what we see on the ground. So for one, it accounts for this geographic spread. The reason that people were writing Sumero-Akkadian texts, learning Sumero-Akkadian texts in a place like Turkey or Egypt, is because they were buying into this bigger culture, scribal culture that is associated with the Sumero-Akkadian language. This is also a very prestigious combination of language and script. In many places it's the oldest form, so when people started to write, they were exposed to the very idea of writing through the fact that people were coming using the cuneiform script, which conveyed Sumerian and Akkadian, and they say, well, this is how you write. If we want to write, it obviously comes with Sumerian and Akkadian as a language, and only later did they make the step that actually we don't need to represent Sumerian and Akkadian. We can use this writing system also to represent our spoken languages. And another thing that we've already dwelt upon is the fact that the texts that we have in these languages are linguistically conservative, so the extent of change that we see is not in proportion to the time and geographical scale of where this writing is being generated. So another critical element, of course, in a cosmopolis is that there should be a common cultural tradition that people are buying into. So the question then becomes, what is that cultural tradition? One thing that we see is that there is already at the beginning of the second millennium an institution called the Eduba, which is Sumerian for the tablet house, the schoolhouse, and we have found archaeologically quite a few of these places, not only in Mesopotamia, though primarily, also beyond that in regions in Syria and in Turkey, where children were learning to write Sumero-Akkadian texts, and despite the fact that they were writing often hundreds of kilometers away from each other, they were all learning broadly the same texts. So if you were in Uruk, or all the way in Ebla, or in a different place altogether, you were studying, with some small differences, the same texts. You're all learning the same hymns, the same set texts, the same lexical texts. So there clearly is a common curriculum over a very broad region. There's also several core narratives that repeat throughout the areas of Sumero-Akkadian cultural transmission. Gilgamesh, we have Gilgamesh in modern Syria, in Turkey, in Iraq, in all sorts of places. So basically, whoever is becoming skilled in the Sumero-Akkadian writing system is also being exposed from the very beginning to core literary texts, to core cultural texts. So there is this broad area with a common cultural tradition. There's also other areas where we see this. Famously, it's the Mesopotamian scientific tradition. So one of the things that expands with the Sumero-Akkadian writing system is elements of cultural scientific knowledge that are developed in Mesopotamia, things like mathematics and astronomy, for which they were especially famous. One of the reasons that we have 60 minutes instead of, say, 100 or 360 degrees in a circle, all of that comes from this tradition. So it's not just literary texts and things like that, but also scientific knowledge, also modes of scientific presentation, things like the list system. It's very Mesopotamian. So all of these are spreading along with the Sumero-Akkadian writing package. In terms of prestige, it's clear that this was a very prestigious tradition. We see it already in this hymn of Shulgi, where he's speaking very boastfully of his own knowledge. This is a text from about 2000 BCE, in which he says, when I was young, I learned at school the scribal art on the tablets of Sumer and Akkad. Among the highborn, no one could write like me. Where people go for instruction in the scribal art, there I mastered completely subtraction, addition, calculus, and accounting. The fair Nanibgal Nisaba provided me lavishly with knowledge and understanding. I am a meticulous scribe who does not miss a thing. So here, at the very highest level of society, the king is expressing an interest in being associated with this very prestigious knowledge tradition that is expressed through Sumerian and Akkadian. And of course, famously, almost a millennium and a half later, we have Ashurbanipal, this king of Assyria, who makes many of the same claims about his knowledge, and again derives a great deal of prestige from his association with the tradition. In this very nice relief, we see that even as he's depicted on his horse as a virile hunter / warrior, he has in his belt the stylus, the writing implement, with him at all times to convey his great interest in and respect for this tradition. And I also repeat this passage that is central to the Assyrian Renaissance event, where he boasts, like Shulgi, again almost 1500 years before him, that Marduk, the sage of the gods, gave me wide understanding and broad perception as a gift. Nabu, the scribe of the universe, bestowed on me the acquisition of all his wisdom as a present. Ninurta and Nergal gave me physical fitness, manhood, and unparalleled strength. I learned the lore of the wise sage Adapa, the hidden secret, the whole of the scribal craft. I can discern celestial and terrestrial portents and deliberate in the assembly of the experts. I'm able to discuss the series, if the liver is a mirror image of the sky, with capable scholars. I can solve convoluted reciprocals and calculations that do not come out evenly. I've read cunningly written text in Sumerian, obscure Akkadian, the interpretation of which is difficult. I've examined stone inscriptions from before the flood, which are sealed, stopped up, mixed up. This is not so different from what we saw from Shulgi. So the enduring prestige of the tradition carries on over a very long time. So if we get back to this idea of a cosmopolis and we ask, is there such a thing as a Sumero-Akkadian cosmopolis? I think the answer clearly must be yes. There is this broad geographical area where people are engaging with texts written in a single tradition. Of course, the depth of this cosmopolis is very shallow. The people who are engaging with these texts, both in Mesopotamia and more importantly beyond Mesopotamia, are a very small scribal class. We're thinking of a literate population in the few percentage points at most. So this is not something that penetrates necessarily very deeply, but it does exist. But it has limits, this cosmopolis, and this limit really becomes clear once other languages start to be written, and we see that this cosmopolis begins to contract and narrow until it's limited largely to the Mesopotamian core. So we see this phenomenon mostly in the second half of the second millennium BCE, where in a lot of these regions where people were writing at some point in Sumerian and Akkadian, they slowly make a shift where they start to write their own local languages, some of them in cuneiform script, some of them in other scripts. So we see at various different points in various different places, languages like Hittite being written down, Hurrian, Elamite. Then as we move into the first millennium, a lot of the Northwest Semitic languages, so Phoenician, Aramaic, Hebrew, those sorts of languages. And as these languages become written, in the places where they are written, people start to produce fewer and fewer Sumero-Akkadian texts, and in many places they stop writing them altogether until, as I said, it's restricted really to the core, the Mesopotamian core region. This phenomenon is a so-called process of vernacularization. Vernacularization is where you take a language that previously was spoken but not written down, and you make the decision, we're going to start writing this language. Usually it's the language that people are speaking in the place when the decision is made. This requires an active choice, because in all these places people were already writing in a certain language, and then somebody makes the decision that actually we want to write a different language even though we already have this other tradition of writing. Usually the reason is because they want to promote some sort of a sense of national identity apart from the one that's conveyed by the older language, or they want to write in a medium that's easier to a broader group of people, where they don't have to first learn a foreign language to be able to read and write. And ultimately this process leads to the displacement of the previous cosmopolitan language in favor of this new vernacular language. So the process sometimes can be very quick, sometimes takes longer, but it's very widespread. So it makes sense why people would do this in areas where they never spoke Akkadian or Sumerian at all. Again, the result, once we see this process, is that many different languages start to be written in places where previously only Sumerian and Akkadian were written. In the region of modern Syria in particular, we have a huge profusion of different writings of language and script. Here's two examples from a site in southeast Turkey today, in Karatepe, where there's a bilingual stela. One side is Luwian, which is an Indo-European language. The other side is Phoenician, which is, of course, a Semitic language. And just to give an indication of the extent to which there was a profusion of different languages all of a sudden being written down, there's this inscription of Yariri, the chief of the city of Karkemish around 790 BCE, where he claims that he reads at least 4 languages. I say at least 4 scripts, that is. I say at least because the text is broken, so it might be that there were others that are lost in the inscription. And he says that he knows 12 languages. The scripts that he claims to have been able to read were the cities writing, that's Luwian hieroglyphic, the Surian writing, that refers to Tsur, Tyre, that's Phoenician writing, and the Assyrian writing, that's of course cuneiform, and then the Taimani writing, which is ancient North Arabian. The language that we're interested in specifically is Old Aramaic, which is the language that first is written down at this point in this region. So as one of the many languages that start to be written down, we find the oldest texts in Aramaic. There are various little states in this area that start to produce texts in what is recognizable Aramaic, and once it starts to be written down, all of a sudden there's quite a lot of it. So there's many different little states that are all producing texts in Aramaic, all roughly at the same time. That's the first few centuries of the first millennium BCE. So this is the first time that it becomes possible for anybody to write Aramaic. Before that, it just wasn't done, didn't have its own script, and it wasn't the received tradition. So at this point, because of this process of vernacularization outside of Mesopotamia, people developed the ability, the necessary tradition to produce texts in Aramaic. Very quickly, this zone of Aramaic textual production comes into contact with the Mesopotamian core. One of the first places that we see this is in this 9th century statue of Hadyisi of Guzan, Tel Fakhiriya. So this is a statue of the king, slightly larger than life, and it has a bilingual inscription. So on the front of his skirt, here the quality is not so high, but there is an inscription. We have a close-up, and the inscription is this one over here. It's a very standard inscription written in cuneiform, Sumero-Akkadian, fits perfectly within the tradition, and that's at the front. So that's the first thing that you see. That's clearly the important one, but for whatever reason, he also felt it was important to add on the back of the skirt the same inscription, but in Aramaic. And here we can see that it's very much an afterthought because the planning is poor. In the front, the cuneiform fits perfectly. All the lines are smooth. Everything is aligned. In the back, the Aramaic version, they ran out of space. They go over the skirt. So clearly, this was not the priority. It was the traditional, prestigious cuneiform that was the priority, and Aramaic was something that they decided was important, but slightly as an afterthought. One of the nice things about this text also is that in the cuneiform version, he calls himself the governor of his area. In the Aramaic version, he called himself the king. So there's a little bit of inflation of titulature when he's not speaking in the prestigious language. In any case, although this is the first place that we see the two languages coming into serious contact, very, very quickly, once Aramaic writing becomes an option, we see that it spreads almost instantaneously and very extensively into the Assyrian core and indeed throughout Mesopotamia. So I'll just give you quick overview of the evidence that we have of this development. So we'll start with just references to the Aramaic language in Assyrian sources from the Neo-Assyrian period. So there are references to Aramaic. It's recognized as a distinct package of language and script. They don't differentiate between language and script here. When they're speaking about Aramaic, it's always this combination of Aramaic that's written in the Aramaic consonantal script. It's never written, with one exception, very late and outside of Assyria, in cuneiform. It's always this combination of script and language. There are references to things like an Aramaic document, an Egirtu Armetu, writing of texts both in Assyrian and in Aramaic, so the Nizbi Ashuraya and the Nibzi Armaya. And these are just two, but there are many, many of these examples. One of the things that's interesting about all of these references is that they're very ordinary. There's nothing weird or exotic about the fact that there are Aramaic documents. There's never anybody who's writing, well, it's in Aramaic, there's an issue. It's completely natural when they're referring to Aramaic documents that this is something that happens and that this is okay. There's not a problem with it. It's not an exotic language. There's nothing weird about this happening. They have many people in Assyrian official lists that are translators for all sorts of languages. There's never any reference to somebody who's translating Aramaic. So it seems that there was widespread knowledge just on this level institutionally for processing texts written in Aramaic. There's also no clear association in any of these texts between the Aramaic language and a specific place or a specific people. It's not associated as the language of group X or group Y. It's just a language like so many others. And as I said, from the context that we have, very much a natural, normal language. So we have a lot of evidence of the use of Aramaic throughout the Assyrian world, early and often. The most obvious visual example of this are depictions of scribes in Assyrian reliefs. So whenever there is a scribe in an Assyrian relief visually depicted, he's never by himself. They always come in pairs. And the pairs, it's not just that there are two of them, it's that both of them are writing using different media. So there's always one writing on a tablet or writing board with a stylus, and another one writing on parchment or papyrus or some other soft medium with a ink writing implement. So you can see here all of them, the two pairs. There's the one with the tablet and the other one with the parchment. The tablet, of course, is for cuneiform. That's the medium for writing that script. And then the other one is writing in Aramaic. So always scribes are working in pairs, one of them writing Sumero-Akkadian, one of them writing Aramaic. And this is every single depiction of scribes that we have from the Neo-Assyrian world. One of the interesting things here also, just to give a sense of relative status, is that although they are always working in pairs, the one that writes in Sumero-Akkadian is given visual priority. Either he's standing in front of the one that is writing in Aramaic, or he's the one that's nearer to us when the two are superimposed one over the other. So they recognize that there are both languages that are being used systematically at every level, but nonetheless, the cuneiform one is still the one with the inherited prestige. We can see the comfort with Aramaic language also indirectly. There's a very famous tablet in which an official in Babylonia writes to the king and asks if he can send his correspondence to him in Aramaic. The king answers, actually, no. Why would you not write and send me messages in Akkadian? Really, the message which you write in it must be drawn in this very manner. This is a fixed regulation. So on the one hand, it seems that we don't accept Aramaic, but the implication here is that both the person writing and the king himself would have no problem writing in Aramaic. They know Aramaic. The issue here is not that the language is difficult, it's just that's not how we do things. This is not the way that the correspondence functions, so it is not acceptable in this context for you to write to me in Aramaic. It's not that I don't speak Aramaic, it's that that's just not how this works. We see this tension between writing and speech also in other objects. In the 8th and 7th centuries, we have these very nice lion weights that come from Nimrud. These are official weights, that people use if there's a dispute about things in the market. How much does something weigh? Is somebody rigging the weights? These are the official weights that people can then use to see if people are being honest when they are weighing goods and exchanging goods. They come with inscriptions. Here, very prominent on the body of the lion is a formally executed inscription in Sumero-Akkadian and in cuneiform, where it says, Palace of Sargon, king of the land of Assyria, 1 mina of the king. So it tells you who it belongs to, gives you the authority of the king and the institution of the palace, and it says this weight is 1 mina according to the measurement of the king. And then there is a secondary Aramaic inscription that is bigger, but in a less official position. and it says simply Amina of the king. So in this case, they don't need all the official stuff, that it belongs to the king, that it's of the palace of the king, that it is the Mina, that it is associated with the palace. But here they just write that it's a Mina of the king. So if you want to use this weight to see what the measurement is, you don't have to read the cumbersome Sumero-Akkadian thing. You can just read quickly, oh, it's a Mina of the king. And you read that in a second, and you know what the situation is. And the official inscription, you don't need to bother with it at all. And this is not the only one. I'll give you another example, though there are several. So here again, you have a very formally executed cuneiform inscription where it says Palace of Sennacherib, king of the land of Assyria, half a mina. And here the Aramaic inscription, again bigger, but in a less official location, just says half. So that you can see very quickly that the weight is half of a mina. So it's clear here that although the official script and language is Sumero-Akkadian, the practical and easy to use language for most of the people that would have come into contact with the objects is obviously Aramaic, to the point that they just write a very quick note that's easy to see and quick to use elsewhere on the object. We see the spread of Aramaic also on other objects. So this is a photograph of a seal impression of an official in Khorsabad, Dur-Sharukin, the capital of Sargon II. And to help with the clarity, we can see here the letters for ease also in Hebrew script. So it says here, Pan Ashur Mar Sarise Sargon. So this is a little bit weird. Probably we need to amend it to have in the break 2 L's, and then we get Lapan Ashur Lamur Saris Zi Sargon. So belonging to Pan Ashur Lamur, the eunuch of Sargon. So this is a very high-ranking official in Dur-Sharukin, whose own personal seal is in Aramaic rather than in cuneiform. Interestingly, we also know a guy called Pan Ashur Lamur, who was a eunuch of Sargon, from other texts of this period. So this is probably one of those places where you can link a person's seal with references to this person in other texts. And this is not unique. There are many seals of officials working in the Neo-Assyrian state that are written exclusively in Aramaic. We also start to get, at a certain point, quite a lot of documents, legal, practical documents that are written either bilingually or exclusively in Aramaic. So on the left we have a copy of a bilingual tablet. So on one side is a cuneiform Sumero-Akkadian text, and on the other side is the Aramaic version. There's also exclusively Aramaic dockets like the ones on the right. One of the things that's interesting here is that even when we have the Aramaic text is an almost exact copy of the forms that come from the Sumero-Akkadian tradition. So it's not that this is a different tradition that they're now starting to write, it's that they're just taking what they used to write in Sumero-Akkadian and now writing it in Aramaic, presumably because it's easier for the people that are doing this. There's no other reason why you would make the switch, because the texts otherwise are one for one in style, context, register, everything. There's also things like labels. So on pottery, we have a lot of Aramaic labels from across the empire. And one place in particular we have a lot of evidence of Aramaic writing is the city of Dur-Katlimu, halfway down the Khabur River, where we have, for instance, this very nice adoption contract where there is a footprint of the child being adopted on the clay tablet, and then this Aramaic text that on one side is inscribed and on the other side, on the actual footprint itself, is in ink. But again, this is a form that we know from the Sumero-Akkadian tradition, just that now they're using Aramaic instead. And this is from an area that's absolutely at the core of the Assyrian Empire. So these are not things that are happening at the fringes, these are things that are happening at the center. What do all of these sorts of texts have in common, however, is that Aramaic is pretty much limited to low prestige media. So we don't see any royal inscriptions in Aramaic. We don't see any of these big religious texts, big steles, other monumental things in Aramaic. The places that we see Aramaic are in the sorts of texts where prestige is not as important. You don't write your monument in Aramaic, but you can write a little note to yourself in Aramaic, a legal document of minor importance in Aramaic. So this is really limited socially to the lower levels. That's not to say that there didn't exist certain texts in Aramaic of a higher cultural value. I would argue that there is a distinctly Neo-Assyrian genre of Aramaic literature, of which there are two very good examples. One is the Achikar text, another one is a story within a papyrus from Egypt, Papyrus Amherst 63, in which there's a story that's clearly borrowed from the Assyrian royal tradition. We don't need to get into the details today, but there was a broader vernacular literature, storytelling in Aramaic as well. It's just that it's very poorly preserved, and the texts that we do have, they come instead from places like Egypt, where conditions were much better and more favorable. So I'm not the first person to argue this. Stephanie Daly, already in 2001, was making the case that piece by piece, evidence is coming to light to show that high and semi-popular literature composed in Aramaic arose long before the Assyrian Empire came to an end in 612 BCE. There are further bits and pieces that indicate that Aramaic was seen as the language of Assyria rather than Sumero-Akkadian. One of the ways that we see this is the script that we today think of as Hebrew, actually in the Hebrew tradition is referred to as the Aramaic script. So the oldest Hebrew texts from the biblical period, they're not written in what we think of as the Hebrew script. They're written in a script that looks a lot more like Phoenician. Now we call it Paleo-Hebrew. At some point they switched to the signs that were used to represent Aramaic in Mesopotamia. So in the Hebrew tradition, they refer to it as the Assyrian script, the Ktav Ashuri. So clearly for them, when they think of Assyria, they think of Aramaic writing, not of Sumero-Akkadian. There are other indications also within the Bible. For instance, when Sennacherib is besieging Jerusalem, and he's official, the Rabshakeh, a title that we know also from Assyrian sources, of course, is invoking the people or inveighing the people to surrender to the king. Officials from the city come and say to him, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, and don't speak with us in the language of Judah, in earshot of the people that are on the wall. They don't want the people in the city to hear the message. But the interesting thing here is he doesn't say, please speak in Akkadian, please speak in Sumerian, please speak in Aramaic. The assumption is that the language that they have in common is Aramaic. That's the language of Assyria, not Akkadian, at least in a spoken setting rather than in a written setting. So when we start to summarize the picture for evidence of Aramaic, we see that there is a lot of Aramaic all at once as soon as this becomes an option for writing. We see this also in correspondence. So this is a very nice text from Ashur, fairly unique, of a letter between two Assyrian officials written in Aramaic. Again, the form mirrors perfectly what we would expect for a letter written in Akkadian. Some people suggest that this is a draft of the letter that then was sent in Akkadian, but we can't prove that. We see also that there are tons and tons of Aramaic names throughout the Assyrian population. Again, not isolated by social class, so we see it from the highest social ranks to the lowest. We also see that this is not a question of a new group moving in, because there are plenty of people with Akkadian names that give their children Aramaic names, plenty of people with Aramaic names that give their children Akkadian names. So there really is this confluence of languages and naming practices. We even have possibility that there are some Aramaic names for kings and gods, but we don't need to get into that. There's also a lot of borrowing, syntactical and lexical, so there are plenty of Aramaic words in Akkadian and vice versa. There's syntactical influence in the written Akkadian of this period from Aramaic. So again, there's clearly an overwhelming influence of spoken Aramaic in the speech world of Assyria at this time. And yet, to get back to where we started, when we look at the textual output of this period, the vast majority of it is not this Aramaic stuff that we've been looking at, but texts like these written in Akkadian, and of these we have tens and tens of thousands. Of the Aramaic ones we have a mere fraction, and when it comes to the sorts of texts, as we also discussed, these are all monumental and really grand and fancy. The Aramaic ones are all fairly marginal and secondary in character. So the question then becomes, if they're speaking Aramaic, or at least many of them are speaking Aramaic, why are they not writing more Aramaic? And here there are several practical limits on the use of written Aramaic in this period, in this area. One is the enduring prestige of Sumero-Akkadian as a scribal tradition, as this former cosmopolis. We can see this in the person of Ashurbanipal. So when he wants to present himself as somebody who's knowledgeable, who's wise, what does he have to look at as the examples? It's the examples of his ancestors, and all of that is in Sumero-Akkadian. All of the texts are in Sumero-Akkadian. So if he wants to present himself as being in continuity with this tradition, with this knowledge, it all has to be done in Sumero-Akkadian, because that's the tradition with which he is associating himself. So Aramaic writing, they can use it, but only in those areas where prestige and engagement with this continuity and this tradition are not as critical. There's also the question of institutional inertia. So even if it might be easier for people to use Aramaic, institutions are often very slow to change. So if this is how an institution does things, like correspondence, if correspondence is always handled in Akkadian, it's not so easy just to say, well, from now on we can write in Aramaic, even if we know how to do it, because that's just not the way things are done. And it takes time to get these things changed, and it's quite likely that by the end of the Assyrian Empire, actually, a lot of the correspondence was conducted in Aramaic. It's probably the reason that we are missing so much of the correspondence from the last period of the Assyrian Empire, at least one possible explanation. And then a key fact is that Aramaic, unlike Akkadian, is written primarily on perishable media like papyrus and parchment. So even if there was a whole world of Aramaic writing that coexisted with the Sumero-Akkadian sphere, the vast majority of it will not have survived because it wasn't written on clay, wasn't written on stone, so the conditions were not conducive. That's why, for instance, the only real Assyrian texts that are Aramaic in language and literary in character that we have from this period are from Egypt, where preservation conditions are much more favorable. I showed you earlier a picture of this Achikar text, but most of the scroll, even in a place like Egypt where conditions are perfect, looks like this. So even in the best conditions, things written in papyrus, in parchment, just don't survive. So it's almost certain that there's a whole world of Aramaic writing in this period, in this place, that is just irretrievably lost because it wasn't written on media like stone and clay. So to conclude and bring everything together, when we think of Assyria, we shouldn't think of it as this place where everybody was speaking Akkadian, writing Sumero-Akkadian. This is really a place where we have two different languages coming together, Aramaic as the dominant language of everyday speech, and Akkadian, Sumero-Akkadian as the inherited language of culture, knowledge, scholarship, that sort of thing. So, final thoughts. One thing to take away, Aramaic was everywhere in the Assyrian world. It's not a marginal phenomenon. It's absolutely central to the state. There's a two-tier system of language and script where the more prestigious a text is, the more likely it is that it will be written in Sumerian, and the less prestigious, the greater the likelihood that people can write it in Aramaic because it's more convenient. Another point to take away from earlier is that the Aramaic language is not the language of the Arameans in this world. It is just a language, as much an Assyrian language as an Aramean language or anything else like that. And as I discussed in my previous talk, Arameans don't really function as an ethnic category in this world anyway. So the final conclusion, before I stop yappering, is that Aramaic already at this point is an Assyrian language as much as Akkadian. Yeah, and I'll stop there. No, Basim Araba. Thank you.